Gotcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's our Saturday book. This is video number 3 on the Convoluted Universe, book 1. And we are beginning chapter 6. And this is our second week of doing this because I just didn't want to overwhelm everybody. I think it's a good idea to think about this stuff. So before we begin, I want to say a thing about Dolores Cannon. She claims in her books quite frequently that she was sort of selected to pass these bits of information in all these books on to the world, to put it out there for modern people to read, partly because they in the spirit plane kind of stumbled on her doing hypnosis, and through her hypnotic subjects, they were able to access a real live human being who was ready to listen. So she was ready to listen. She was smart enough to put it into books. She felt she was willing to accept that this was a purpose for her. She provided an entree into our world by doing these hypnosis sessions and taking people back in past life regression. And she kind of stumbled on all of this. She didn't sit down one day and say, you know, I'm bored helping people stop smoking. Let's talk to spirit guides and let's look at astral planes and let's do past life regressions. It didn't happen that way. It was a gradual step-by-step process. It took her a while to comprehend what was going on. Her books were written quite a long time, sometimes decades after the events in the books, because she wanted to collate and digest. I think it's important. It can get a little irritating when she starts talking about she was chosen to do this, but I understand what she was trying to say. She was the right person in the right place at the right time, and they have maintained this knowledge is out there. So the story is, through hypnosis, you can access your subconscious, where all this knowledge is stored for everybody. Most of us are incapable of connecting with our subconscious in a meaningful way. And hypnosis is a tool that helps. Meditation helps, but hypnosis is a great tool for this. Her kind of hypnosis, which is a little different than run-of-the-mill hypnosis. Even though the knowledge has been there, we've been carrying it around, we were not ready to hear it. She would argue, I believe, that because you and I are listening to what she has to say in this book, we're ready to hear it. Kind of drawn to it, led to it, it's presented to you. You go on YouTube to watch kittens one day, and the next thing you know, you're listening to Dolores Cannon. You're ready to hear it. And for many years, I knew she was on YouTube, and I'd watch a minute of her, and I'd just go, ugh, I can't. Just wasn't ready. And then her books would keep popping up in my, suggestions from thrift books. And I go, So finally, if you remember, ages ago, somebody requested Jesus and the Essenes. And I thought, well, I'm really pretty hard on religion, especially Christianity. And I don't really mean to be. I mean to be honest about my take on it, if anyone cares to listen. I thought, well, I want to be fair. So let me look into this. And mind you, it's the organized, institutional, bureaucratic stuff about all religions that I just find repellent. Messages of people like, whether or not they were real, the message is real. The Buddha, Jesus, Gandhi, human beings, imperfect as we all are, but with transcendent messages. And I'm willing to listen to that because there's a common thread. Love one another. That's simple enough for me. So we did Jesus and the Essenes, and it got a huge response. People just really were interested in asking for more. So we've been going down this path together. This is the first time I've read any of these books. It's all revelatory. It's all new to me. And I may change my opinion tomorrow. I stick around, you never know. But in the meantime, let's get into this. That's enough of me, babbling. So she believes that hypnosis, especially her technique, helps the subjects dive into their subconscious. And then they access sometimes directly their past life, sometimes through their subconscious, or they can go directly and access information from another plane and interact with these guides, custodians in this in-between time, this spirit life between life and death, the bardo. So she has gotten permission to do this. She's sometimes told, well, we'll let you know ABC, but you have to wait for XYZ. You're not ready. Or we'll let you know XYZ people are not ready. And I think that's very interesting. I'm taking it on face value. I'm not going to parse what I think about all of this until much later. So let's move forward. So some of this information is just too much for our tiny little brains, and it's slowly leaked to us as we have evolved. And that's why her books they are decades after the events, they overlap, they move forward in time, because as we can handle more complex ideas, her books become more complex. So there's all what she says, people are always interested in Atlantis. And so she collated this information about Atlantis for many subjects. And she said that they often saw Atlantis, experienced lives in Atlantis from different time periods in the earthly experience. And what we need to know is Atlantis is not one place. Atlantis is not like, oh, I'm going to Atlanta and it's a city and there you are. No, it's not like that. It's not, I'm going to North America. No, it wasn't like that. It was a culture. And it started in one place and then it spread. And it was the name for the world as a whole at one time. And not everybody was part of the culture, just as there are isolated pockets of different civilizations even today. Look at the very few remaining indigenous people of the rainforest who still carry on their traditional lives. It was kind of like that. They were everywhere, but they were not 100% ubiquitous. This is the word, Atlantis is the word for the most developed part of the civilization, and not the entire world, and it gradually developed and evolved. And it existed thousands of years ago. Set aside what we've been taught, what we may believe about the age of the earth and the length of human civilizations. These books have a different narrative, and you have to have willing suspension of disbelief if you're really entrenched in conventional historical thought or archaeological thought. You need to set that aside and just be open-minded. You don't have to believe it. I'm not trying to mesmerize anybody into believing anything. I just think you should entertain this as a very interesting theory. So it existed thousands of years ago, and it reached its highest levels, reached very high levels, and then degraded. And very similarly to what has happened, perhaps in not quite as dramatic a way with us, because I don't think we ever achieved any great heights. But we did achieve heights. We did become sophisticated. We did become technologically knowledgeable. But our spiritual understanding, our psychological ability to handle it, our emotional growth have not kept up with our technological abilities. That's what happened in Atlantis. So many people who are alive today, according to canon, many people who are incarnate now, lived in Atlantis, because we're now at a similar point in the cycle of history when Atlantis plunged into the abyss. Her words, not mine. She tries to explain things sometimes that I don't necessarily completely understand, and I'm doing my best to condense it. So if it doesn't make any sense, I strongly advise you read the book. There's no way I could do all of the descriptions and all of the details of what she sees and what she explains. It's really involved, complicated. But she explains time that it operates as a spiral. Everything's happening at the same time. And similar circumstances repeat and repeat and repeat. And so we've returned, we souls here today, have returned to prevent the same mistakes that happened in Atlantis, to repay karmic debt that we incurred back then. Not saying that we haven't also lived since then, just that was one thing. And that we volunteered to be here. Now, this is according to canon, that we were drawn. I guess, you know, Denise and I have debates about this. She believes it's completely a materialistic sort of a physics thing. Energy is drawn to energy. I think we're arguing semantics. I think when you say you volunteer, I think you put out energy and you're drawn to energy. And you're drawn to the energy that you most need for your higher ascendancy. Basically the same thing, you know, potatoes. So we volunteered to come here because we have karmic debt. We wouldn't be here if we had no karmic debt. We'd be off having a much easier time. But we could repay the karmic debt of 10 lives here because of what's unfolding. So when you become, this is me, not Diane Cannon, Dolores Cannon, Diane Cannon, Dolores Cannon. When current events get you down, that's what I think about. I tell myself, okay, you know, this really sucks. But 10 lives worth of karmic debt, okay. That sounds like a pretty fair trade-off. So let's go. And it's all in the blink of an eye, too. Time has no meaning, so it's important to remember that as well. So she has this subject whose name is Brenda, who went under and told about the glory days before Atlantis. The main civilization was Galactic, and they came to help us, and Atlantis emerged out of that. And so this was way before and way better, and they helped Atlantis to develop. So we needed to do that. For us to be, Earth needed to do that for us to be allowed into the galactic community, which apparently it's on a different plane, but it's also, I mean, it's this weird, it's like talking about what they call UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, ETs. We're talking about beings that are actually mostly higher evolved, not always good, not always perfect, but higher evolved at a different vibratory level, on a different plane. And yes, they may look like they're coming from the planet down the street, you know, but there's more to it than that. And our little brains simply, we keep trying and trying and trying to understand, trying to collect physical evidence, trying to figure out which star system, and all of that is really kind of pointless. But we are a part of a larger energetic community, let's put it that way. And more advanced ones don't want to deal with low vibration, dense energy. They can sometimes, they can lower themselves literally to deal with us. They'd rather not. They want us to be elevated, and they want to help us elevate it. I mean, there's some generosity of spirit. So anyway, they left. They got everything set up. Everything was running smoothly. Atlantis was thriving. But then people are people. And our usual situation, we devolve. And we destroyed ourselves. We destroyed the civilization of Atlantis. And it had to do, I mean, she's in many of her books, she's told numerous different people's versions of what happened. But if you summarize them, put them all together, what you get is the picture of some sort of misuse of energetic technology, misuse out of ego, power, control of a handful of people who were in charge of this. But it was also reflected in the basic degeneration of society. People were getting lower. They were hybridizing humans and animals and putting them to fight with each other in the arena. And they were, even though they had started out at a more elevated frequency, you know, the lure of that earthly thing is very powerful. And it took down the civilization of Atlantis, and it culminated in this clearing of just clearing it all away and starting over. And so it was legitimate planetary changes, and they appear to be cyclical. But how much of that has got to do with us only getting so far and never getting beyond that spiritually, and then boom, they have to start over because they really do want us to succeed. So we got tossed back as far as we could go again, and the galactic community watched all this happening. We were given agriculture and fire and learning how to build things, and they had just about reached the point where they were ready to learn about their position in this intergalactic community. And we were seen as urbane and developed. And intervention of otherworldly beings they were able to speed things up and give us energy that was conducive to being creative and stimulating our minds. And they did this in various places besides Atlantis, and it was one place, but as it developed, it spread. It really took off, and the world now is the same as that civilization spreading. It's like all these different Western civilizations, but they speak different languages and they have different customs, but it's really similar. That's the idea. So people were attractive and happy and emotionally and physically healthy. They looked well. They mixed with many people. So there was no one appearance of people. They didn't need that false construct of race. People are people. But they looked similar to each other. There were no dramatic differences in appearance because everybody intermingled. And nobody cared. That wasn't important. You were human. They had started out with everybody being reddish blonde, and that kind of went to light brown. And because of various, I'm extrapolating here, but from what I've also read, various different civilizations coming and hybridizing, doing genetic stuff, for good reasons and not so good reasons. People started to look a little different and they were isolated more. So they didn't use a lot of metal, and overproduce. They didn't, it was a simple civilization, but it was a sophisticated civilization, which is kind of counterintuitive for us. They used stone and clay. They didn't build with metals, but they manipulated. Now this is interesting. They manipulated their materials with telepathy, and they could use energy to overcome gravity, and they could build huge buildings with big stones. And you see places like that are actually older than what we think that civilization was. Pyramids, Gobekli Tepe, I hope I said that right. Places in the Andes. These were pockets of that civilization, and built on much older Atlantean time civilizations that had started a lot of this construction with energetic tools and telepathic tools. They had simple instruments to manipulate energy, and there's a description which is just not simple. And they could often do that with one person, but they needed the mind. They sometimes needed the consent of everybody in the group, in the social area, for the energy to flow in a positive direction. like getting consensus in a meeting and getting everybody in a positive frame of mind and in agreement, only more sophisticated. They developed their psychic abilities much higher than we have. They didn't need telephones. They didn't need government red tape. They used telepathy, and they could communicate directly with people anywhere, and telepathy was used for consent to get things done. And they didn't use it to change people's minds. They used it to transmit ideas. And they also were verbal, no different than we are, but telepathy is much more effective. Telepathy, we have it. It's a human ability, it's a psychic ability, and we need to use it to develop it. But where do you start? You know, we've lost quite a bit of our understanding. We have the abilities, but not the understanding. They were more conscious of developing these things, and they, like a muscle, you know, and it was a normal part of their children's development to learn how to, you know, make things move around or whatever. People always relied on their psychic ability for survival. It's just they didn't realize it, and we still do. We just don't realize it. They had to be harmonious. These energies had to be harmonious. The whole human community needed to be in a state of cooperation and peace before the galactic community wanted to interact with us. We had to balance ourselves, and we came very close. If we could have balanced ourselves, then we would have been balanced with the galactic community. They use psychic abilities to put energy into balance and to heal, because if you remember from her books on Nostradamus, and a book we're going to do soon, not by Dolores Cannon, there's a growing school of thought that, which is supported by physics, that our energy, our consciousness, goes beyond our physical into the etheric. And as any Reiki master would know, healing energy can heal you physically. But that's for another day. So they use their psychic abilities that way. Our very small knowledge of that kind of healing, that's the start of it, where they were. They believed that the mind and the psyche were two different things. The psyche was more dexterous. I would call that your conscious energy. Your mind is like your little computer in your head. Psyche is more fine-tuned. It functions through the mind. The mind is like a tool, kind of, called the mind, the brain. And the mind and the psyche work through the brain, but the mind is more of a materialistic thing, and the psyche is more of an energetic thing. See why this is hard to explain? So people in the Atlantean civilization were all very developed and advanced with this knowledge. And the people who were not part of the Atlantean civilization, who were alive at the same time, these little isolated pockets, tended to use their instinct. They also had the psychic abilities and stuff, but they were more primitively undirected than the Atlantean people. The government was really pretty much not needed. There were lots of mystical and psychic researchers. There was an organizational body that took individual reports about people's personal insights and facts and stored them in a central place. They kept extensive records in a psychic system, and because it was a psychic system that people accessed telepathically, that's why archaeologists can't find evidence. So little information is available, because we didn't even know that it's out there in the subconscious and it's accessible through the psyche, but we've forgotten how to do that. It's not written down necessarily. You need the correct psychic ability to tap into it. They did use paper, but it all rotted away. The thing is, this is so long ago, and there have been so many cycles of cataclysm, you wouldn't find anything. It would be remarkable to find anything. This record keeping was sort of like a localized Akashic records, and existed on an energy level, and it was it still is waiting to be found, but it's not physical. The pyramids and stone circles, Stonehenge and places like Newgrange, those are all devices that were used to focus energy to help tap into records. And yeah, they had stuff to do with, it's a feather. They had something to do eventually with the solstice and, astrological and astronomical things, but that's not what they started out for. The precession of the equinoxes has affected the accuracy of the alignment of these things, and as a result, they wouldn't work even if we could figure it out because they're no longer in the proper position. But those with strong solar alignment would function. The pyramids are perfect, and the pyramids are full of this energy, and it's why some people go into the pyramids and hallucinate, and some people go into the pyramids and die. And it's not a curse. It's their vibrations are too low and they can't handle the energy. Archaeologists might find megalithic structures on Atlantis, but they're not aligned because of the destruction of the cataclysms that happened. So they're like gigantic stone computers that use the natural energy flow of the earth. And if we even knew that and we knew how to use them, we'd still have problems getting them to function because of all the shifts. They didn't use metal. The more a thing is manufactured or altered from the original form on the earth, the more it's out of harmony and the more vibration it loses. So, highly, what's the word I want? Food, packaged food, highly processed food. So things taken from the earth and unaltered keep their energy. That's why they use stone. And crystals have energy. There's truth to all that working with crystals. People like to not us, but in general, people kind of poo-poo that. But the reality is, there is energy in there. You have to know what you're doing is the problem. So they had a way to manipulate with energy to make stone pliable like clay, and then it would return to its harder state, or to move it around up against gravity. They ate food but balanced with their energy and with the energy of the earth. They eliminated medical issues because of their lives, the way they lived. They ate, okay, you're going to hate me for saying this. They ate a high fiber, high vegetable diet with some meat and eggs. I mean, like we know, right? We know we should. There were advanced mystics who didn't eat at all, who got energy from the energy around the earth. And that's true of some ETs too. The animals they had are similar to the animals we have. And I think I've read so many of her books and we haven't done quite all of them. So I'm not sure if we've talked about this, but I'll throw this out there just, as a little tidbit. Animals are a different kind of soul. So, but they have a soul. So our idea of, I can't read this word. Oh, okay. Our idea of early civilizations, like if you go into archaeology or you go into anthropology, remember the dawn of everything? We're wrong. That doctor from Lithuania, whose name I can never remember, the woman, there are remnants on Earth, but they're remnants of much older civilizations that the survivors of those fallen civilizations tried to revive but didn't have the ability. So what we consider ancient archaeology is the modern leftovers built on top of really ancient archaeology. And they were trying to rebuild their shattered lives. These Atlanteans used levitation, and this is where, I thought this was interesting, this is where the myth of the magic carpet comes from, because it was a thing, kind of. They manipulated energy and gravity. They used, like ETs are seen, UFOs are often seen going like that, and it's about electromagnetic energy. They used it to travel. They used it to move things. They didn't need planes and cars, and I'm sure Shell Corporation and Exxon Corporation would be very unhappy to hear this, but they didn't need fossil fuels. This ability to do this is unique to humans in the universe. I thought that was really interesting. I didn't realize that. It didn't sound like that, but that's what she said. Lamas in Tibet were isolated from all the goings-on that destroyed Atlantis. And they were able to retain some of the knowledge, and some of them can still do this. You'll hear people talking about them levitating off the ground, and isn't that ridiculous? And this is mythology. They really can. So the galactic community was upset that we were ignoring our psychic abilities, and they're upset with us again because we're ignoring our psychic abilities. And it's really important. Everybody has them, and it's just really important to take quiet time and just give yourself over to having that ability flourish in you again. Their entertainment, she describes their entertainment, and I thought it was really interesting. They did dances, but they incorporated levitation, and they were really into colored streamers, and that's like those worship dances they do in Christian fundamentalist churches where they dance with ribbons and it's only the women, Maypole dances. They had plays and music and live shows, and a lot of it they did telepathically. So the destruction of Atlantis was had to do with the focusing of the direction that was going on in the psychic centers. Remember, I told you they misused energy. They misused their abilities. And it was a severe collective mental trauma. We haven't gotten over it. We're reliving it. That's what's going on now. And it caused a psychic burnout. It's like being temporarily blinded when you see an explosion or you look at a light bulb or something. And as a result, the survivors avoided psychic abilities for several thousands of years out of fear and trauma. And the Atlanteans did use crystals to focus, and they were extremely advanced in their use of crystals to focus energy, to manifest things, to heal things. They manipulated crystal molecular structure to focus energy. So they were able to do a whole lot more than we can because we don't know how to manipulate the molecular structure. We have the capacity, not the understanding. Different crystals focus different energy, so starlight, radiation, cosmic rays, they all had purpose and uses. Archaeology found some in the jungles of Central America, and these crystals still glow at night, and they look like stone balls, and they were used as lights. Some were by the Atlanteans, some were used as heat. They saved the forest, they didn't burn wood. These are called stones, but they're really crystals. Here's an interesting thing. I've talked about that book, Forbidden Archaeology, and by Michael Cremo, C-R-E-M-O, and it's over 900 pages. It's a remarkable book. It's very dry because it really isn't a narrative. It's page after page of archaeology that's put away. Nobody understands what it is. Nobody can explain it. Usually it's anomalous. So somewhere in South America, I'm not going to give you misinformation. I don't remember if it was Bolivia or Peru or, I can't remember. But somewhere south of the equator, they found a jar. And it was like a vase, with a narrow neck and then a rounder bottom. And this thing had two poles, like magnetic poles, in the inside and on the outside. And it was made of the hardest substance on the planet, which I don't remember the name of, but a rock, that even today, engineers can't figure out how it was made. Not with lasers. It wasn't done with the use of water. It wasn't done with friction. They can tell with electron microscopes. They have no idea how this thing was made. They can't replicate it, and it's got polar inside and outside. And it's got some weird embedded hieroglyph type things, symbols around it. That's just one thing from this 900 plus page book. So fascinating. So these balls of light, these crystals, were used for heat. They were used for light. They had special wall sconces or pedestals, and they would just set the ball in there. It sounds really pretty. They could use different sizes, and they would arrange them in really pretty patterns. That was part of their decorating. Oh, I wrote this down to remind myself. I'm glad I did. In our book that we read, Jesus and the Essenes, they describe exactly that. They describe old crystal orbs, and they describe holders, and they didn't quite know what to make of them, but this is the same technology. Cannon worked with a guy called Phil. We've heard his name come up in her books before. She worked with him for years, getting information from a place called the Planet of Three Spires, which was a repository. And he was able to access information from Atlantis. And he would be able to describe for her what things look like. He saw flying craft with two people in them, like in the Jetsons, from one city in Atlantis. Then there were others that held many people. So they weren't airplanes, they weren't burning fuel, they were moving telepathically. And he saw a sparkling city, like a crystal spired city in the distance. So they had, then he comes to a different time period, and they know it's a later time period because they've kind of degraded and they're not using as much of their psychic energy. They're using manufactured technology to move around. And they have some sort of an aluminum alloy. This is bad. This is not good. This is degrading. But they still use crystal power aligned with the energy lines in the earth. They also have off-planet travel, but only the elite, the high priests, are allowed, and they have contact with other guys from other places, but not the general population. So already you see this hierarchical thing happening. This is that degradation of the civilization. So only those with really high moral character and understanding that are part of the spiritual evolution and part of the learning process are allowed to interact. But you get the sense that they're keeping that for themselves rather than sharing it with the general population. And it wasn't, the major part of Atlantis is today dry land, but no, that's wrong. I wrote that wrong because I know, because I've read several different things about it. It was not on the North American continent. It was on the ocean floor, and it's not dry land, and it's going to rise up again. Originally, it was land that was above the water in the Atlantic Ocean, and when that cataclysm happened, a lot of it broke and went down below, was submerged. Some of it has reemerged. So we're seeing changes happening we're not even recognizing. Some of Atlantis is some of the land that during the time of Atlantis was underwater is now rising up. Some of Atlantis that was land that sank is now rising up. Most of Atlantis was underwater when bad things happened. There had been many civilizations and many types of people and many economic and class levels. So they did begin to separate and lose that unity. And there were other continents, but really Atlantis was the center of civilization. Now, what does this sound like, you know? The greatest country in the world. Anyway, other areas had no name because they weren't part of the world government and the Galactic and Atlantean connection, and they just sort of ignored them. They had their own names for themselves, but they weren't referred to. Interestingly, though, they weren't running around with clubs and in fur. They were technologically superior even to us. They were just really different. They weren't as morally advanced. This is the epitome of the search for the truth. It's not an even, constant elevation. It's erratic and inconsistent, and it goes backwards and forwards, and it breaks apart. Many previous generations had spiritual evolution more evolved than today. Very high, the highest ever. We're far from that. There were many much older civilizations, but none came as close to Atlantis in evolution morally. The history is of continual evolution and loss and rebuilding. That's our history. Then there were great advancements, and they were centered in the civilization of Atlantis. There had been smaller, less influential pockets of growth that were more spiritually advanced cultures, but none that affected such a wide number of people, the whole swath of the population, in the way that Atlantis did. Some individuals were even more advanced than that, but there was not the general awareness of that in the entire population. And that, you know, that's also how it is today. There are people who really have their act together, and then there are the rest of us. Anyway, even after a civilization was destroyed, there were always those few people who kept the knowledge. This is, you know, the ancient mystery schools, and who guarded that secrets. They protected. Okay, there were skills, abilities, and knowledge that were abused and brought civilization down. And so these people who remembered, these people who retained the capability to deal with it and had the knowledge, did keep it secret. That's why they're called mystery schools, or occult. Occult means hidden, because their fear was that it would be abused and misused again. And people were just not ready. So there was much upheaval geologically. And this is natural, the book says, because the Earth's younger. And at the time, the Earth was even younger, and civilization got destroyed. There were people, even when our scientists today say there were no people. The evidence is just obliterated, which stands to reason when you think about polar shifts and movement of ice and water and volcanoes. They were buried or submerged or, you know, swallowed up. Culture was lost without a trace, and some people survived, but the larger civilization was destroyed. There were always some who knew that the change was coming and they had prepared. People always think their present is the highest level of civilization, she's been told. Canon has done regressions telling of volcanoes and floods and quakes long before Atlantis. And there's no evidence at all of these civilizations. You have to take it on, I hate to use the word faith, but you just have to accept, if you're going to believe her, you have to accept that this is true, because there is nothing to prove it. Phil, the subject, saw a city in the distance where there were the keepers of knowledge, who they equate in the book to the Elohim of the ancients. They're the keepers of moral and physical laws of truth. They combine natural and physical laws and spiritual awareness, and we're getting to a book that does exactly that, which blew my mind. I mean, this is how this little book club works. I read these books because people suggest them, and like I told you, you know, sort of get drawn to them. And then the next thing I know, they put forth interesting ideas, and a book pops up completely unrelated to Dolores Cannon and reiterating what she says, which I love. It's great. So, not yet. So this whole city had all this knowledge that Phil is seeing, and there was a type of energy that elevated the people to a level that high above most other people, was why they kept in this city. Those of lower energy weren't let in because it would have damaged the energy, and the energy in the city was too powerful, or they would have been damaged by the energy in the city. So Phil was able to get information relayed from the city without actually physically going into it as a hypnotic subject. see here. They telepathically communicated with others outside the city all the time, so they weren't out of touch. He says, you know, this might be our past, but time has no meaning, so who knows, you know. But the lesson in this is there's no barrier to thought. Thought is energy, and there's no barrier to thought. Those approaching felt how the energy intensified as they got closer. And this is only one of several such cities. Each city had different types of high energy, and they were used to learn different things. The buildings were made of powdered crystal that helped the energy, so they were intentionally created that way. And this building method was not used outside the cities of high energy. And the crystals were used for lights. They had shuttle-style craft that were used for utility, you know, doing work. And his crystals helped to power them. Personal vehicles ran on levitation, telepathy. They had beacons or rays of crystal energy that formed paths in a relay system like a highway that was broad enough for multiple vehicles. I thought that was mind-blowing. The city used the general energy. They didn't need the energy in the, you know, in the ether. They didn't need beacon paths. They used communication of telepathy in the city. And they used sort of things that were sort of computers to store information. And she said that we need to know that there is telepathic communication around the globe and around the universe. We just need to tap into it. Not everybody did this. Some didn't care. Oh, now this is starting to sound familiar. Some didn't want anything to do with learning how it worked. They'd rather watch the NFL. Some were just too busy indulging in the temptations around them. So interplanetary communication was used to increase their knowledge, and as people evolved, they got more and more awareness of other extraterrestrial situations, and they also increased their actual physical contact. We'd been watched. They knew we were evolving. They were ready for us. They had machines for the care and storage of food and clothes. They didn't have to do laundry. Now that's where I want to be. They didn't have to cook. They didn't have to do laundry. They didn't have animals in the city because the energy in the city was too high. But they were outside the city. The lifespans were a little shorter because of the high energy. They only lived about 50 years. But their learning was speeded up, so they were much wiser. In the cities, they had no disease, no ill health. Outside the cities, they did, but they lived a little longer, 60 to 70 years, which seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it's all about the energy levels. And here's what they told her. Your self is separate from your body. Your life is just an extension of a part of yourself. There's much more to you than when you look in the mirror. Thank God. People of Atlantis were more perceptive. They could do things with their minds that we simply have forgotten how to do. They were motivated by a desire to learn. We don't have a lot of desire to learn most of the time, and they had no desire to earn. I thought that was interesting. So we lack their motivation. We have the same abilities. We have the ability to metamorphose, to reassemble our atomic structure. We just have forgotten how. Listen, I can't even do a hula hoop. So I have a hard time imagining that I would ever be able to develop the ability to rearrange my atoms, but okay. So they use an application of natural law having to do with vibrations and energies, but fear holds our abilities back. I don't know. I think it's more involved. I think it's coordination. But anyway, you can change the model of your body. It just would be a change in vibration, and that's how they would shapeshift. And it all got misused at the end of Atlantis. There was a loss of harmony, a loss of the talents and the abilities that they had. They began to be misused as liabilities. They began to use their powers for gain, and it damaged them. They became more deceitful and treacherous and started limiting other people You can't do that. So this is related to the idea of the mythology of half people, half animals. You know, Sagittarius. What's it called? Is it the Gorgon? What was the one with the lion face and the serpent, and you know, those mixed mythological beings? They actually tried stuff like that, and to keep the qualities of both animals, and they would do it with people, and the descriptions are really grim, you know, like somebody with the back end of a horse and the face of a human, and they would use these creatures. They'd treat them terribly, and they'd use them as servants, slaves, and abuse them. And this hindered Atlantis's moral progress. It was a time in which animals could have human awareness. It was given to animals, and let's see here. Normal animal life force is not as aware, not on the same intellectual level, and not the same energy. And they were trying to manipulate that, and you can't do that. It's kind of against natural law. And it was absurd, and it muddied genetic pools. It caused all kinds of problems, morally, spiritually, energetically, politically, physiologically, you know, just ridiculous. So there were cases where the spirit helped human souls incarnate into animals for a reason, and there were cases where people meditated and went into animals. So those folkloric stories, you know, I know Native American stories have a lot of that. I believe there are some in Ireland. There's, you know, that truth to them. But eventually they were used not for good, and it was discontinued because it caused disharmony in groups, and it wasn't fair to the animals, because animals have a different energy and they have a hive mind. That's why they travel in packs, even when they're not bees. You know, they have a hive mind. Their mind is different than ours. Not worse, not less than, just really different. And people lost that perspective. In crossing species with different spirit natures, the body would change because the body would express the spirit nature. And genetics is influenced by the spirit. I thought that was really interesting. And there is light in our DNA. That's really interesting. Because humans are a spiritual expression in nature. Humans are a spiritual expression in nature. This is why humanish forms of many ETs, it's a reflection of their spiritual state. Half humans couldn't reproduce. They were not genetic, they were spiritual expressions. And so they were fussing around with their energy. We call it hybridizing, and this is saying that it wasn't true genetic experimentation, it was energetic experimentation, and you can't fool with spirit. Human spiritual energy is expressed as human physical form. Physical reality of the universe is entirely based on spiritual energy. So what you see is what things are spiritually. All physical forms are translations of spiritual reflections. The Minotaur, the Centaur, the Mermaid. And all of this messing around was mostly localized in the Atlantis core. And the disharmony of it was formative, and it threw the energy out of alignment, out of balance, and it became a manifestation of the conditions that led to the downfall. You could see how messed up spiritual energy was in how messed up these creatures were, I think is what they're saying. We can't change ourselves on a conscious level with free will. It requires a change of energy. So you can sit all day going, I want to be a mermaid, I want to be a mermaid. It's not going to happen. So then she met with John, and John's sessions, he could look at the scenes of Atlantis in a spiritual library. He said the city that he was in, and we don't know if it's the same time or place, because remember, this was over a period of several thousand years, and it was global. He was in a city that was arranged like a pyramid, It was gold and luminescent. The people were beautiful, like movie stars. Their hair was multicolored and had flamboyant styles. And they were in robes that changed color, and they had fancy jewelry. I mean, it was very attractive and creative. The buildings were of many different styles. They had electronic ramps that were staggered. There's a huge description. I'm just summarizing, really worth reading. They used hovercraft. They had flying cars. They used solar crystals. Then they got up in their estimation of themselves, and they pitted these half people, half animals in the arena. They forced them to fight. They thought that they were superior. They looked down on these creatures. It was a cruel sport. It was cold, and they had no emotion. So you're talking about Atlantean psychopaths taking over and destroying the energy everywhere. The crystal, they had crystal guns. Hang on. He sees the lab where all this is manifested, where there were hybrids. They think that these people doing this think they're superior, and they have contempt, and they manipulate others. They're self-centered. Some are cannibals. They created noxious insects. They messed with life forces, because remember, your shape, it's got more to do with your spirit energy than, I mean, whether you're a human or a dog or an insect, has to do with your overall spirit energy and not anything else. So they messed with these life forces. They didn't respect them, and that's why Atlantis ended up getting destroyed. It all culminated in this energetic abuse and an explosion, but building up to it, just like building up slowly. Anyway, they used and attracted negativity. He was shown walls of crystals that were used for healing. You'd go in and the crystals, you know, like a compartment, would heal you. They treated everybody holistically, body, mind, and energy and emotion. They had a room, this is really interesting. They had a room where you would go and say goodbye to loved ones after they died. And they sort of chose that they were ready to go. And they were really fascinated. I mean, this seemed lovely, you know. So they knew that they wouldn't be parted for long. These people were fascinated with the manipulation of energy, and it went too far. At its height, people would live for hundreds of years. Families were huge. One family could fill a whole town. They did not live communally. They had individual space. They had their own spaces with courtyards, but they ate together. They had beautiful art, beautiful crystal spirals. They had beautiful music. They danced with ropes of flowers. They had these hybrid servants that at first they treated well, like pets. And under oceans. Oh, okay, under the oceans, you can see parts of these newer civilizations that grew on top of the old Atlantis. That's how old these things are. And they are eventually going to be seen. But they did genetic mixing. But what they were really doing was spiritual, energetic mixing. They may or may not have understood that fully. They did cloning experiments. And this is long before Egypt, long before Rome and Greece. And that's why they have those legends. Some people remembered and passed on the stories. Today, we're doing it again. And there's a mixing of species going on. ETs are trying to help us and keep us from destroying ourselves, as happened with Atlantis. After the destruction, Atlanteans in space came back. So they actually took some off planet and brought them back when things calmed down to seed the population. And they landed in Egypt, Peru. What do they have in common? Ancient civilizations and pyramids. The destruction used crystals to bore into the Earth's core and it blew up and it affected other planets and comets with this increased change in the energy, and it caused the Earth to shift from its poles. And they knew astrology. They were warned about these comets. They used crystals and their mind energy to split the Earth and get to the core, and it caused disharmony and a cataclysm, and the energy released was like many volcanoes, many earthquakes. It caused mud shoals, and nobody could navigate. Groups of priests tried to counter this, stop the boring into the core. They knew that Atlantis would sink. They fled in ship bubbles, some kind of telepathic conveyance. And they went to Egypt and they kept to themselves with advanced knowledge and crystals. And the question is, what happened to them? And that's, look at that, perfect timing. That's the end of chapter 6. The next chapter, chapter 7, is the mystery of the pyramids. So we're going to end video 1 here. Well, the first video of today, but this is the end of video number 3, part 3 of book 2 of the convoluted universe, my convoluted expression of where we are. So I'll be back in a minute with, well, however long, with